Okay. Okay, I might as well get started. So what I want to do first is just see if you guys have any questions or any requests about what I should cover. Anyone? Wait, can someone just confirm that they hear me?
We hear you.
Yay, okay.
Yeah, we can.
Yes, I hear you.
So the first thing I'm going to do is that I have created a review PowerPoint here. It's already on Western Online, and I'm just going to go over, it's just a compilation of important slides from the different weeks. So I'm just going to go over that quickly. Then we're going to go over the answers to the practice questions, and then it's just going to be if you have anything else you guys want to cover. So obviously you guys should know the basic, before I do that, let me just tell you a little bit about the exam structure. It's going to have 2 sections. So in section 1, you will be able to pick to answer 5 out of 11 questions. So the idea behind this format is there's like 1 week or 1 concept you really don't get, you can skip it. In section 2, there's slightly longer answers, and it may ask you to like interpret excerpts from our readings. So you'll ask to answer 3 out of 5 questions. Now, because this is an online course, it really is open notebook. So on these answers, what I'm really looking to see is that you understand the concepts more than just being able to like regurgitate the definitions. And that's why questions will have ask you to give examples of something, like the difference between disease or illness. So that really shows your understanding. So I would just try really hard in those parts to demonstrate that you understand the concepts. Does that make sense? Okay, so
yes, thank you.
okay, good. All right. And then in terms of this exam is going to cover lectures and readings, but in terms of the readings, I'm going to emphasize things that we talked about in class. So if I ever pull a quote from a reading, I guarantee you it's something that we spent time on in discussion. That makes sense. Okay, so now I'm going to start the PowerPoint review. So of course you guys need to know the basic definition of medical anthropology. It's concerned with human health and factors that contribute to disease and illness. Okay, so this is from the very first lecture, but it's extremely important and some students miss it. Hold on, let me let students into the, okay. Health-related issues, including disease and treatment, are far more than narrow biological phenomena. So it's essentially saying that they're influenced by social and cultural factors. So if you're going to understand health in general, you can't just look at biology. You have to look at social and cultural factors. That is the basic premise of medical anthropology. So I'm just going to go on, and you guys can interrupt me at any time if you have questions. Okay, let me. Oh, okay, that's my own audio. All right. So the reason that the example I give you to explain the premise is just that how would we solve the global HIV/AIDS crisis? Well, scientists are trying very hard to develop a vaccine that would be extremely helpful, but the idea is that vaccine is biology. Is that enough? No, to get people to take the vaccine, to the vaccine to be effective, majority of the world's population would have to have it. And to do that, oh, sorry, my audio, I keep on hitting my audio. I don't mean to be doing that. Okay. To be effective worldwide or even with a country, a vaccine would have to be inexpensive and generic. Individual governments have to be willing to administer it, and people must be willing to be vaccinated. So there's so much beyond just biology here, and you would have to hire medical anthropologists or consultants and people to work with individual countries and people to get this to happen. So the premise is that health is not just biology. You have to look at social and cultural factors, and that is a very point of the field of medical anthropology. That's what it does. Okay, so very basic definition that you have to know is that biomedicine refers to the dominant medical paradigm in Western cultures today. It's called biomedicine just because it's predominantly based on biology. And this term is preferred over Western medicine. Can anyone tell me why? Because biomedicine is now practiced all over in the world, including in the East, like countries like Japan. So it's misleading to say Western medicine. It's just easier to say biomedicine because it's based on biology. Oh, okay. All right, so what is traditional alternative medicine? It's any system of healthcare that has ancient roots, cultural bonds, trained healers, and a theoretical construct. So what are some examples of traditional medicine we talked about in class? We spent time talking about, a little bit of time talking about Chinese medicine, but we mostly talked about Ayurveda medicine, which is a traditional medical system in India. And it fits this definition because it's ancient. You know, it's based on these Sanskrit texts, it's part of the culture, and you have to train very long time to become an Ayurvedic practitioner, and it's grounded in theory. And we just got a little bit of that theory. It's the idea that everyone has these three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, but for everyone, one is predominant. So a practitioner would want to find out your dosha and base your treatment accordingly. So some of you guys did a quiz for that. Okay. Okay. A definition early on in the class that's important is critical medical anthropology. So the basic backstory of this is that early medical anthropologists were just interested in looking at health at the local level, you know, the health of a community. They ignored the wider causes of determinants of human health and wellness, including power. So critical medical anthropology is an intervention in this, and it emphasizes structure and power inequality in healthcare systems and the contributions of health ideas and practices to reinforce inequality. So in short, it's looking at how larger inequalities and power relations impact health, right? If you're just looking at health in relation to a community, it's just too narrow because these larger power inequalities impact health. And the United States, you know, the kind of health that to get good health care, you need health insurance. You know, a large percent of the population lacks that. So these larger economic and power inequalities are going to impact individual health. So that would be something that a critical medical anthropologist looks at. Okay. Now, something we talked about quite extensively was Benedict's cultural relativism. So she was an ardent cultural relativist, as she discussed in Anthropology and the Abnormal, which we read for class. So she argues that normal and abnormal are culturally determined. So there is no universal idea of what is normal and abnormal. Like think of spirit possession in India. In, you know, at a Hindu temple, it's completely normal for a person to become obsessed, possessed and start writhing around on the ground. That's considered normal in Hindu culture, you know, so that's an example. What's normal and abnormal is culturally determined. But what made her an ardent cultural relativist is that she felt that morality, the sense of right and wrong, is also entirely culturally determined. So there is no universal right or wrong. And that's a rather an extreme view, because she's saying like, oh, hey, if it's considered okay within a culture to kill someone, to commit murder, oh, that's fine. Right? So that was her brand of cultural relativism. right? So there's no universal morality. Morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. Now, what does she mean by this? In our society, we have an idea of what's okay. But when we say that, oh, this is right or okay, it's fine, it's normal, what we really mean is that there are things we regularly do that are considered socially okay. We don't really mean they're like right in a moral sense. We just mean that we're used to them. Does that make sense? You know, let's think of an example, like if you get a bad cold, your friends might even expect you to be a little bit grouchy and grumpy and maybe even a little mean. We accept that because it's kind of a commonly socially approved thing that you act cranky when you're sick, right? So we consider it morally okay just because we're used to it. Does that make sense? Anyone?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So a really important distinction we learned in class that you definitely have to know for the exam is the difference between illness and disease. Now, what I have here is not the definition, it just sort of gives you a sense of it. Illness is what a person feels when he goes to the doctor. So I have a sore throat, it's making me cranky, I'm having trouble with my exams, you know, my friend's mad at me, you know, all those things are part of your illness. The disease, what he has on the way home for the doctor's office, the disease is just the diagnosis that your doctor or nurse is going to give you, which in this case, let's say it's strep throat. So strep throat is actually really narrow, it's your disease, but everything related to your experience of it, you know, including maybe a fight with your roommate, is illness. So what is the actual definition of both? Disease refers to the literalization of phenomenon whose experience is always culturally, socially, and psychologically mediated. So when a doctor says, oh, you have strep throat, they're literalizing something, but your experience of it is very different from that diagnosis. It's influenced by culture, social world, psychology. Okay, so okay, somehow I missed this slide with the actual definitions of each on it, but here they are, and this is just straight from lecture. Disease is the abnormalities of the structure and functions of body organs and systems. So all they are is physical abnormalities, like strep, you have a bacteria, right? Illness is a subjective response of the patient being unwell. So it includes things like what do you think caused your illness? You know, maybe you were out late, you weren't taking care of yourself, you lowered your immune system. And it includes how it affects your behavior, the way you act, but also your social relationships and your psychology, right? It's everything that goes along with feeling unwell is illness. So that is a crucial contrast. So on the exam, you'd want to know how to define disease and illness and then give examples of both. Okay, so something we talked about is the difference between biomedicine and traditional medicine. One big difference is that biomedicine is primarily interested in the recognition and treatment of disease. So you want to diagnose the disease, you want to treat it, and you want to cure it. Traditional medicine is primarily treating humans' experience of sickness. So not just the disease itself, but everything that goes along with that is more of a focus of traditional medicine. Another thing that relates to this is traditional medicine is very interested in preventative medicine. So you could see an Ayurvedic practitioner, even if you're well, would just get tips of how to stay healthy, and that's totally accepted. I think that'd be a lot less accepted if you went to a doctor and you're like, how can I stay healthy? I mean, they might just immediately send you home, right? Okay. This is a repeat, this slide. Okay. Okay, hold on. I don't know what's happening here. Okay, there are repeats in this presentation. I apologize about that. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. Hold on, I'm gonna go to some of your lecture slides for a minute here. I just got a few more things to emphasize. Okay. Looking for illness narratives. Aha, here it is. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, so a very important concept in the class are illness narratives. So it's a person's lived experience of monitoring bodily processes, right? So Arthur Kleinman exemplifies this approach in his book, The Illness Narratives, and he calls for the clinician to document the experience of illness. And he's basically critiquing biomedicine for erasing the patient perspective. So he's particularly talking about chronic disease. So in chronic disease, it's important to look at the sensitive solicitation of the patients and the family's stories of illness, the assembling of the mini ethnography of the changing context of chronicity. And that all that means is that when somebody has a chronic disease, they have periods of feeling really badly, periods of feeling better. So it's just looking at all those different experiences in the chronic illness. Okay, so, okay, hold on. Okay, so the idea is that a patient, the illness narratives starts in the patient's lived experience of the illness. Then the patient is going to communicate this to family members using like metaphors and rhetorical devices. You know, they're going to have ways of telling the story. Like if you have a bad headache, you're like, oh, I feel like I've been hit with a sledgehammer. You know, might tell it in a particular way. But then ultimately the person goes to the doctor and tells his story to a clinician, a doctor, a nurse, a physician's assistant. And it's only in that interaction with the clinician that the illness narrative fully moves to the exterior and is formed. And that illness narrative, of course, is also going to be influenced by the kind of questions that the clinician is asking. So that essentially is the illness narrative. Now, this week was about narrative in general. So we looked at narrative in relation to Kleinman's idea of the illness narrative, but we also looked at, okay, hold on. Nancy Sheffers Hughes' work on organ transplants. And we're going to learn more about this later. This was the fieldwork she did after she wrote Death Without Weeping. This was her second big research project. So she's looking at the black market for trading in human organs. So where poor people in third world countries are selling their organs, primarily kidneys, to rich people in nations in Europe and the United States. So she said that in third world countries, there's a lot of like rumor and false beliefs about this. So she wants to uncover the truth about it. How does she uncover the truth? Well, her approach is just to talk to as many people as possible. Hold on. Talk to as many different people as she can about what happened to them. So the main people she wants to talk to are donors, but also like anyone who knows anything about it. Accumulate all these different narratives and stories. And then the last point here is to figure out the truth value of these stories. What's true and what's false. And it's kind of interesting that she never even tells you how you do that. She's just like accumulate all these narratives, all these stories, and try to figure out what's really happening. So this week was all about showing those two approaches to narrative, right? Okay. So, okay. And then since we're talking about Nancy Sheffer Hughes, this Death Without Weeping was her first research project, right? So she's studying the experience of impoverished mothers in a shanty town in Northeast Brazil. Now, this was important because of the content of the study, but also it teaches us about how to be an ethnographer, how to be an anthropologist, but also an activist. Okay, so what's key to remember about this is that she did her first fieldwork. Let me rephrase. Her first trip to the shantytown was in the 1960s, where she was a Peace Corps volunteer who was, she called herself an injection doctor of sorts, right? She was trying to help mothers and their babies. So her focus was entirely medical. Then she decided to do a PhD in anthropology. She ended up coming back, but not as a as a volunteer, but as an anthropologist, where her job was to find information about people. So I think in both discussions, we talked about some of the difficulties of trying to do both, and some of you saying, you know, it's extremely challenging and maybe impossible to do both well, right? Okay, let me just see if there's anything else to cover here. Yeah, so the main idea, her main argument, which a lot of you argued against, is that, okay, there's this really high rate of infant mortality. And it largely it's because the mothers can't stay home with their babies. They have to go off and work. The babies are kept at home with older siblings or sometimes the dad. They're given formula rather than having the mom's nurse. That powdered formula is mixed with the water that they use, which is full of bacteria and parasites. So babies are dying at a very high rate of diarrheal diseases. So Nancy Sheffer Hughes argues that these mothers seem to lack maternal sentiment. They don't seem to care or nurture for these babies. And the reason that is the case, she argues, is that there's a suspension of the ethical. So essentially these mothers' lives are so difficult and so terrible that there's a temporary suspension of the ethical. So it just basically means that like it's ethically right to care for your body, to care for your baby. These women are just not doing it because their situations are so hard. The ethical, the sense of right and wrong gets suspended. But a lot of you guys criticize this work a lot and saying, you know, essentially it's not right for her to morally judge these women who live in such desperate and terrible circumstances. So I'm going to go back and fix this PowerPoint for you and repost it. Some reason it got messed up. I apologize about that, but I have covered everything that I wanted to cover in the presentation. Now, are there any questions or things that you want me to discuss? Okay, so what I want you guys to do right now is if you have the sample midterm review question sheet, I would get it out. The first question is to find Locke and Sheffer-Hughes's concept of the individual body, the social body, and the body politic. The easiest one is individual body. Can anyone tell me what that is?
It's yourself, your physical body.
Exactly, right? And they argue that it's even universal across cultures that we understand ourselves as being different than others, right? What is number 2, the social body?
It's the connection between the physical body and the social world of the individual.
Yes, exactly. And it's however different cultures have imagined the individual in relation to the social world. There are all these different metaphors saying, you know, if a country is at war, you know, that's going to mean that the individual body is unwell. So it's just all these different ways cultures make sense of the physical body in the relation to the social world. In the slides, I defined it as the seam between the physical body and the social world, but that's exactly right. And then how about the body politic? So it's how social and political forces exert control over the bodies of individuals. So we could say that there's a society with deep inequalities between the rich and the poor, and that the poorest people don't have access to basic health care, and that's rooted in political problems in the country. So you could say these political and economic forces are controlling the body of individuals, meaning they're denied access to basic health care and unwell because of that. So you could see the individual body as suffering because of larger political and economic forces. And it's really what critical medical anthropology looks at, which I mentioned earlier. Any questions about number 1? Okay, so number 2, we already covered, but let's just cover it again. What is disease? Anyone? Abnormalities of the structure and function of the body, right? So let's say a person is diagnosed with an autoimmune disease and it explains a bunch of their symptoms. That autoimmune disease, it's their disease. Illness is much broader. It's the subjective response of the patient to be unwell. So it's their idea of what caused the disease, how to make it better, how it's affecting their daily life, how it's affecting their relationships. That is illness. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so number 1 is an example of a kind of question you could get in a long answer. It says, Arthur Kleinman writes, then there is then no essential medicine. No medicine that is independent of historical context, no timeless and placeless quiddity, that means a thing, called medicine. So explain what Kleinman means by this quote, then explain one way in which the practice of biomedicine in the US or elsewhere is influenced by culture. So what does he mean by this quote? There are 2 parts to it. The first one is that there's no medicine independent of historical context. What does he mean by that? It really means that all medical systems have evolved and changed over time. Even the practice of biomedicine in the US has evolved and changed over time and developed historically, right? We had a lecture that looked at the historical development of hospitals, right? It used to be that wealthy people were treated in their home and then only the poorest of poor went to hospitals. But we've seen that our medical system has drastically changed over the years. So every medicine, whether traditional or biomedicine, has a history and has evolved and shaped over time. But it also says no timeless and placeless thing called medicine. All medicine has a place. So that means the practice of medicine, whether traditional or biomedicine, differs in different communities and different nations. Right, so you could even say that the practice of biomedicine, of course, is different in the US, it's different in Japan, right? So medicine is dependent on both time, history, as well as place. And it's the idea that culture influences medicine. So that's the second part of the question. Explain one way in which the practice of biomedicine in the US is influenced by culture. So the biomedicine in the USA or elsewhere is influenced by culture. So can anyone tell me how biomedicine, like one example of how biomedicine is influenced by culture? The example I used in class is that biomedicine is practiced in the US and Japan. In Japan, there are far fewer organ transplants, and it's not because they lack the technology. The reason is cultural and religious. Can anyone remember what the reason is? They do not believe that brain dead people are actually dead. So they figure they're very much alive. So they don't harvest organs from patients who are brain dead. So they just don't have many organs available, so they can't do organ transplants, right? So that shows how culture influences biomedicine. Another interesting comparison in Japan is that they commonly treat cancer with quite aggressive surgeries. So they have a large number of patients who die on the table in surgeries, but they also can have a higher cure rate, particularly for stomach cancer. So that's another cultural difference in the practice of medicine. Okay, so another thing to prepare for the exam, I urge you to use this matching review because it really has all of the key concepts on it. You know, even have it handy when you're doing the exam. But remember that your answers should reflect your understanding. So typically when students get points off, it's not because they're answering something wrong, they're just sometimes skip parts of the question or don't give enough detail. So if you're going to err on any side, write more, don't write less, right? Because sometimes answers are just a little bit too brief and you'll miss a few points. Does that make sense? So that's really all the tips I wanted to give. That's everything I wanted to cover. Does anyone have anything that they would like to, any question or anything that you'd like me to discuss in more detail?
What did you just say was the thing that you said to have something handy while we were taking the exam?
Oh,
you cut out a little bit.
I can't get this to show up. The matching review that was on Western Online. So it had,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
Could you go over the Cartesian legacy?
Yes. Okay, let me just find where this is. Oh wait, no, that's the wrong, I got it. There it is. Okay, so it's rooted in the work of the philosopher Descartes, and it's the attempt to separate the intangible mind from the material body. So it's the idea that our mind is fundamentally separate from our body, but he also creates these other dichotomies between spirit and matter and unreal and real. So in one of the Arthur Kleinman readings from a few weeks ago, they had a really interesting example with medical students. So a woman came in, said she has debilitating headaches, and then talked about all the stress she has in her life. I think, you know, she had her husband beat her, was having trouble with her child. So she was talking about all the different stresses and difficulties in her life. And some first-year medical student raised his hand, was like, what's the point of this? You know, I want to get behind the real reason for the headache. So that question reflects this idea that the mind is entirely separate from the body. So the Cartesian legacy has influenced the practice of medicine, right? Where we're looking, doctors may look for hard physiological reasons for symptoms and kind of set the mind aside, psychology aside, and not care about it. But what we've seen in the last like 2 decades is that doctors are realizing that the mind matters and psychology matters, and that it should be taken seriously in medicine, and that we really can't separate the mind from the body. You know, stress can cause physical objective symptoms, for example. Is that clear?
Yes, that helped. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, that's me. That's so crazy. Okay. That's funny. Anyone else have a question? All right, last chance. Anyone? Okay, so we don't have a question. We're going to end. I'm going to give you one last chance. Any questions? Okay.